totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Subscribe and follow on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, where you get videos weekly. Links to all the social media sites at bookedonrock.com. On this month in 1967, Jefferson Airplane released the album Surrealistic Pillow. It's considered to be one of the greatest albums to come out of the late 60s counterculture, psychedelic rock era, and considered to be one of the greatest albums of all time. Author Richard Butterworth is back on the podcast. He's here to talk about that album and the band's history. He's the author of the book, Jefferson Airplane, Every Album, Every Song, released recently by Sonicbond Publishing, part of their On Track series. We spend a lot of time on that album, Surrealistic Pillow. We also talk about the band's origins, how they drew on folk, blues, jazz, and even literary visionaries to create their sound and lyrical themes. We get to the band's rise to prominence, followed by their demise. As the book promo states, quote, Jefferson Airplane burned fierce and bright before their decline with the death of the psychedelic dream in Haight-Ashbury's dreamily LSD-drenched hippie heartland. More than any other, the band and their recorded output were synonymous with the birth and death of the hippie era. I put together a playlist of Jefferson Airplane, and you can find it on the show notes page. But first, here is Richard Butterworth. Richard, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, Eric. Nice to be back.
We talked about this last time. I wanted to have you back on, and you wanted to come back on to talk about the Jefferson Airplane book. And here we are. Let's start with where you were when you discovered the band. You were at that perfect age to discover the music of Jefferson Airplane. You write about being 14 in 1968, not knowing much about the band until you hear a pop song from another dimension. That's what you write in the book. Yeah. What comes to mind when you look back at that time when you discovered the band, and what was that pop song from another dimension you speak
Well,
of?
White Rabbit. And as I mentioned in the book, I won't retread it here, but it's, I'd never heard the Airplane before. Somebody brought a 45 to a youth club that I attended. And, from the first time, from the moment it was played, I just didn't let it go off the turntable. I kept putting it back on and turning it over for Classic Fantastic Lover on the B-side. And I was sold on it. And the thing is, at that time, I was kind of, I suppose, typical 14-year-old. It had to be sort of long, heavy instrumentals, so I was listening to Hendrix, The Nice, Pink Floyd, Cream. Nothing wrong with any of those, obviously. But, the common denominator, they all in their own ways kind of conform to the sprawling instrumental jamming of the era. But suddenly there's this song that's less than 3 minutes long that isn't the Love Affair or Marmalade or any of the Tremolos or any of the top 40 pop bands that were around at the time. And I was just blew me away. It sort of packed such an incredible punch. And I think that was mainly because of Grace Slick's voice, which really did seem otherworldly. I was astounded. So, yes, that's what I think of. And, and what goes with that, what attends that, is the optimism of the time, I suppose.
And as you talk about in the book, the rise and fall of this era, this lineup of Jefferson Starship, it's on par with the rise and fall of that entire generation, that counterculture.
Airplane's trajectory was virtually the same as the whole hippie thing.
Fascinating.
I mean, it's almost perfect that they, their first big show was Monterey, they were at Woodstock, and then they were Altamont, which was, is universally accepted as being the representing the death of a hippie dream. Coincidentally or not, right at the end of 1969, end of the decade. I mean, an Airplane were on that trajectory. They mirrored the whole thing. And after 1969, they were not what they had been. They had some good music left in them, but it was they themselves had gone over the kind of top dead center. They were coming down the other side, and they declined as the whole Summer of Love ethos declined, really.
Well, let's get into the backstory of Jefferson Airplane, if you could. Just a brief backstory, where they're from and who makes up that classic lineup, and the crucial element to their story, which is that they were in just the right place at just the right time for their sound to connect with so many fans in the area that they were from.
Well, yes. The classic lineup was Grace Slick and Marty Balin vocals, Paul Kantner rhythm guitar and vocals, Jorma Kaukonen lead guitar, Jack Cassidy bass, and Spencer Dryden drums. Now that was the classic lineup, although by no means the initial lineup. Marty is the facilitator, and he was he was very much of his time. Again, he was as likely to hire someone for the way they looked as whether they could actually play the instrument. And he hired Skip Spence, who was their second drummer, just because he looked like a drummer. He actually wasn't, he was a guitarist, but there you go. Marty, who was sort of almost a kind of walking Lord of the Rings, just kind of saw this thing, oh, he can play drums, he's my drummer. Paul Kantner he hired on almost the same sort of basis, that he hadn't heard him play or sing, saw him wandering through a folk club one night and said, okay, let's get together and make a band. And so it went. That's the tenor of the times, of course. I mean, that's the way things worked in 1966, 65, 66. So Paul is Marty's first hire, and Paul's a Bay Area folk singer who Marty met at a club called the Drinking Gourd. Marty then hooks up with a double bass player called Bob Harvey and a drummer called Jerry Polocklin. And then Signe Anderson comes in on vocals, mainly because that was due to Paul Kantner. He was a big fan of the Weavers. He liked the extra dynamic of a female voice to go with this sort of rather indefinable group of musicians that's being put together. Anyway, Airplane Mark I was completed by Jorma Kaukonen. He was originally from Washington, D.C., but he made a name for himself in the Bay Area, playing the folk clubs, highly regarded as a folk roots blues interpreter. So now Bob and Jerry don't work out, so Marty then hired Skip Spence because he looked like a drummer. Then Jorma suggested his old pal from DC, Jack Cassidy, who was actually a guitarist in DC, but he had to be talked into it a bit at first, but he came into the Airplane on bass. And I think his kind of lead guitar credentials show in his bass playing, because he's a highly melodic bass player. You know, the kind of bass player that people who might not necessarily know any better will accuse of being frustrated lead guitarists. There's more to it than that. But, you know, Jack is a very melodic bass player, and he brought something very special to the sound. So you've got this whole crew. Skip Spence is now proving to have too heavy a drug habit, very unreliable. So he was replaced by Spencer Dryden, who was then playing clip joints in LA. And there you have the classic lineup. Once Grace Slick has been brought in, basically poached from the Great Society, which did then no end because they disappeared straight after. They have the original, the great original band, or the classic lineup.
Yeah, that's one thing I didn't know until reading the book. I am not all that familiar with Jefferson Airplane until now after reading it, but going in, I just assumed Grace Slick was there from day one. I did not know there was somebody there before her. No, Signe was the first, and Signe was Frank Zappa would have called her the straight member of the group. Okay, you sensed she was a good singer. She was a bit mannered for my taste, but you know, she was certainly a very powerful singer. But she really wasn't into the rock and roll lifestyle like the others were, which was slightly strange because her husband very much was. And Jerry, her husband, was their lighting director for a while, and they wanted him out. Signe was basically too needy. All she wanted to do was bring up her baby. She used to have the Airplane's manager go off and, you know, fetch her diapers for her and things like that. I mean, all very rock and roll. Yeah.
So yes, it was Signe, but you know, there was eventually Signe was let go. She wanted to leave. She didn't trust the manager they had at the time, who was certainly a wide boy character called Matthew Cates, who wanted to take the Airplane into all sorts of strange directions, and no one really trusted him, and certainly Signe didn't. She didn't sign anything. She was right not to, as events proved. Signe left eventually in, I think it was November the 15th, 1966 was her final gig, the Airplane at Fillmore. The very next night was Grace's first gig.
Just like that, she stepped in.
Absolutely, yeah. You know, there's a live albums with the evidence. It's, you know, literally Signe's farewell and Grace's arrival, and it's a fascinating compare and contrast exercise just to listen to the two together, because you can tell that Grace is just a little bit hesitant, because they're good CDs and they're the full concert in each case. And Grace is just a little hesitant at first. You think this isn't the Grace Slick we know and love, or it's not the Grace Slick we come to know and love. But by the end of the gig, she's absolutely roaring, and you know that she's taking the band in a completely different direction. You know, she's not just a powerful singer, but her entire presence, her being, her charisma, her entire approach to showtime was extraordinary.
And you hear it right away on that album, Surrealistic Pillow. That's the first with her, the second from the band. So the first album, not really, it's not evident of that Jefferson Airplane sound yet, but there would be quite a few influences that would go into the sound of that classic lineup. Also lyrically as well. Can you talk about the band's folk, the blues, the jazz influences, and some of the literary visionaries that play a role as well? Who are the bands and the writers that influenced these guys?
Well, the bands, I suppose. I mean, you had Paul Cantor, who was very into Dylan. He was into the if you like the early folk rock. Dylan or folk music, come to that. The Weavers. Tim Buckley was an influence. Fred Neil was a very big influence. So it was, if you like, some of those American troubadours, if you like, were influencing Paul. Marty was a soul boy. He was an Ohio soul boy. He loved Otis Redding. And it's strange, really, and this is probably indicative of the way he eventually was treated by the rest of the band, in as much as there's not much evidence of Marty's sort of soul music or his soul side coming up on the Airplane's regular recorded stuff. Odd songs here and there, but it's live. And now, when the Airplane played live, Marty could take off and really sort of, it was almost like he was kind of channeling Otis Redding on stage. And not so much of that stuff got onto record because, you know, the various differences came up between inter-band and between the band members, and Marty's stuff was getting rather marginalised round about 1968, 69. In fact, earlier, in fact. Yeah, so that's Marty. Jorma was a bluesman. He was into Gary Davis, Lead Belly, Blind Blake, the great roots blues purists. That's where he was coming from, and he was, you know, he was a very, very highly regarded interpreter of that music. Jack and Spencer were probably coming out, or Spencer was probably coming out of more of a jazz background. He was tutored by a very highly respected jazz drummer called Earl Palmer, who was the guy who put Airplane onto Spencer in the first place. And Jack was a kind of soul, jazz, rhythm and blues, you name it. So basically, there we have sort of 5 or 6 musicians who pulled in all these disparate influences, and take the literary influences as well. So you had Grace, who was reading James Joyce, for example, and that comes out in songs of hers such as Rejoice from After Bathing and Baxter's. Paul was into sci-fi. He was into Robert Heinlein, Isaac Asimov, John Wyndham. Jorma was a philosophy major at college, and you can imagine, well, you know, you can imagine him being a philosophy major, that all manner of esoterica is going to come into his songwriting. He is actually an unsung songwriter. He eventually proved himself the equal of Paul Cantor, I'd say, although Paul's early songs were fantastic. But Jorma really, really started to shine halfway through the Airplane, his tenure with the Airplane. As a songwriter, he matured very quickly. He's very, very good. So you throw all those influences into one big vat, right? And out comes Jefferson Airplane, and they're quite unlike any other band at the time, really.
Yeah, really. It's you know, on the other side of it, I can imagine, though, that the creative frustrations kick in quickly because you got all these different influences and each member would like to contribute, I'm sure, more and more as time goes on. Did that come into play when the eventual...
I think so, yeah. At some point, there were these factions. Airplane did factionalize just about after Surrealistic Pillow. Jorma and Jack were being heavily influenced by Hendrix and Creed in particular. They wanted to get into that kind of heavy blues improvisation. Grace and Spencer were an item. They had a romantic thing going for a while. So they were kind of doing their own thing. Paul just wanted to bust everything out. What the hell? Just wanted to sort of be Paul, really, because he was always quite an iconoclastic character. Marty, who's this kind of soul boy stroke composer of romantic songs, and they're in plenty on Surrealistic Pillow. Things like Today, Coming Back to Me, I mean, which are
beautiful.
Absolutely stunningly beautiful songs.
Stunningly beautiful, exactly. Yeah,
and unfortunately, Jack and Yorma didn't see it that way because they wanted something more edgy, something longer, something heavier, more abstract, and it caused there was some bad blood caused. There was a lot of friction, which really started between Surrealistic Pillow and After Bathing at Baxter's.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Let's start with that first album, which is 1966, Jefferson Airplane Takes Off.
Mm-hmm.
Grace is not in the band yet, as we mentioned. Signe Tolley or Tolly Anderson?
Signe Tolley Anderson,
Anderson, yeah, she's the female vocalist.
That's right.
Now, you write, Takes Off obeys many conventions of contemporary pop music. Crisp, short songs and love ballads, dramatically echoey studio reverb, the birdsy jangling of Paul's rhythm guitar, the optimism and growing social awareness of the lyrics. Little preempts the advances and controversies to come, yet the band is clearly edging towards something more. So what are your thoughts overall on this album, and where is the band edging towards?
Well, I think it's a perfectly decent debut, although much better is to come. But I think the signifiers, all right, birdsy 12-string jangling, they were certainly not the only band in the world to be influenced by the Byrds. But so a lot of the songs are fairly straight down the line folk rock fare, if you like. But there's definitely something more going on. Jack Cassidy's bass lines in particular, I think we're already suggesting this is more than just somebody who's there to batten down the hatches on the bottom end. Again, that's his melodic sensibilities coming through. If you listen to, there's one track called Let Me In, which is the second track on the first side of Takes Off. There's a stunning plummeting bass line on there that's no one else was doing that at the time. That was something else. So it was that kind of thing that was raising the band away from the average group of the time, really. They're delving into socio-political areas and that kind of stuff that Dylan had been doing and, Woody Guthrie before him. And I think the most, my favourite are Marty's words for a song called Running Around This World, which didn't make it to the album, basically because he stuck in there a line, the nights I spent with you have been fantastic trips. Right, now we're in 1966. RCA Victor, who have picked them up, but they're not quite sure what to do with them. But they're a very conservative, huge record company, very conservative. And that line, which is sex and drugs, all in a few words, in 1966 must have blown a few minds in the RCA boardroom. So they didn't like that at all. And that was the first sort of hint of controversy that was going to attend Jefferson Airplane pretty much throughout their career. Record company wouldn't allow it on the album. They tried to do a patch-up job in the studio, which didn't work. So eventually that song was held over until a compilation album came out in 1974. So there you go. We've got the sort of the beginnings of socio-political awareness. And we've got sex and drugs as well. So that's good. That's kind of covering off quite a few bases.
That covers the bases. Yeah, and the label released 3 singles, so they got behind it. It's No Secret, Come Up the Years, and Bringing Me Down. And It's No Secret. Now, you mentioned the Otis Redding influence. We do hear it on this track. And this is the first song Marty Balin writes for the band. And you say there are some Otis Redding influences on this track.
Yes, I think to a degree. I think I think that was a track that he wanted to actually give to Otis Redding. And in the end, they turned out it was a fantasy that he was harboring, that he would have Otis Redding sing that song. But he uncharacteristically shied clear of, he was too shy to go to approach the great man and say, hey, I've written a song for you. I think you could do this really well, which was interesting because he was not one to hide his light under a bushel normally. But I think he was so in awe of Otis Redding that he just thought, oh, no, he's never going to like it. No, I'm not going to do this. So, yeah, right. Yes, it is. There are Otis influences that certainly shine through Marty's recorded work, but I think there are probably more explicit live.
And then comes Surrealistic Pillow. And this is the 56th anniversary of the album. It was released on February 1st of 1967. And we've got some lineup changes here. Drummer Skip Spence and singer Signe Anderson are no longer in the band. And you say Spence had a story similar to Syd Barrett. So talk about this. Anderson wasn't happy and the band wasn't happy with her husband. So there's a lot of drama going on here. Can you talk about their departures and how they find the two new members, Spencer Dryden and Grace Slick?
Well, yes. Spencer, as I said, was recommended by the jazz drummer Earl Palmer. So they got him up from LA where he was playing strip clubs and places like that, and just sort of doing a kind of, really, he was eking out a journeyman's musical existence. And then this sort of bunch of hippies from San Francisco, from up north, come down and say, "Do you want to join our band?" And he thinks, well, that sounds like quite a good idea. So he did just that. Grace was, well, there's no two ways about it. She was poached from the Great Society. And she was in the mind. If it hadn't been Airplane, it would have been somebody else. I think she was hugely respected. She was regarded as being probably the most desirable asset that could be brought to any rock and roll band in the Bay Area at the time. Airplane got to her first. Basically, they paid. I think Airplane's manager Airplane's factotum Bill Thompson paid. I think it was $750 he paid off the Great Society to let them have Grace Slick. It was a sort of severance package.
$750.
$750 for Grace Slick. Yeah, well, that's a bargain and a half for price.
Sure.
Yeah, and that was kind of it for the Great Society, which was a bit of a shame because there were some promising things they were doing instrumentally. The versions of the original versions of Somebody to Love and White Rabbit, which are on the live album Live at the Matrix, which the Great Society made, which ironically they were probably playing support to the Airplane on the night those songs were recorded, because Matrix was owned by Marty Balin, and Airplane played there all the time. But their arrangements are very, very different and rather good, actually. You know, nothing wrong with them. I always felt that they could have, if they'd gone on, that they'd bitten the bullet, maybe try and find another female vocalist, maybe not somebody who's going to match Grace Slick, but, you know, there are others around. I think they could have cracked it, but they knocked it on the head then. That was it. Their heart really wasn't in it anymore.
And Spence, so this was a fragile, mentally fragile guy, drugs play a role.
I mean, he was a bit like Syd Barrett in as much as he couldn't handle the dope. You know, he decided if it's good enough to do, it's good enough to overdo, so he's just going to overdo it. And he did, and it fried him in the end. He started looking like a bit of something of a liability to the Airplane. I think finally, I think the penny dropped when Marty Balin fired Skip after Skip disappeared on a Mexican holiday without telling anybody. You know, and they had commitments, they had, you know, gigs to play and all the rest of it. And, you know, some of their drummers were sort of shot off down south of the border. No one knows where he is. So when he came back, Marty just said, well, that's it. Sorry, got to go. So then Skip left and formed Moby Grape. But Skip eventually, I mean, he couldn't hack it. I mean, he wound up in, that's a long other story. He supposedly, he was allegedly rode a motorcycle wearing his pajamas from a New York correctional institution to, I don't know, somewhere down south, like Florida or somewhere. I mean, it all sounds a bit outlandish, but then it's the tenor of the times, isn't it?
Yeah. And then Signe's story gets pretty crazy from what I read in the book. A lot of drama there. There was issues with, so the band didn't like her husband. That was the deal, right? And she wasn't happy with the
Apparently
band.
He was, you know, which is interesting because Signe, as I said, was really the straight member of the group, and you know, she was clean. She didn't take drugs. You know, all she wanted to do really was bring up her baby. But Jerry Anderson, who was her husband, was another matter altogether. Apparently, he was a real stoner and quite an aggressive character as well. Now, he worked for the Airplane as lighting director, but you know, I think there were various sort of fisticuffs here and there, and you know, they basically couldn't wait to get rid of him. Signe was keen to go. She didn't like the manager, Matty Cates. She didn't like the rock and roll lifestyle. She didn't want to be on the road. Meantime, now this is where Bill Graham enters the picture, because Bill was at that point, Bill was running the original Fillmore Auditorium, and I think the Avalon. The Avalon was his other. No, was it Winterland? Either Avalon, I think it's Winterland. Anyway, so Bill Graham is the big impresario in San Francisco at the time. Carried a lot of weight, a lot of influence. Now, he wasn't financially tied to the airplane at this point, although he eventually did become so, because he became their manager a little while later. But he had, he still carried an awful lot of influence. And often a lot of what he said really kind of, you just, okay, you did it. Bill says it's got to be this way, that's the way it's got to be. Bill didn't want Signy to go because Airplane had a run of shows coming up at, I think, both the Winterland and the Fillmore. And Bill didn't want, he knew that the Airplane were pulling in the crowds. He didn't want this spoiled. So he apparently paid Signy a sweetener to stay with the band, at least until the end of the run of shows that she and the band were going to be doing for him. But after that, she kind of dug in her heels and said, "Look, that's it. Okay, I'll stay a little bit longer, but after that, I'm off." And that was that.
That was that. And she is still alive, Signy?
Signy, no, she died.
Just recently passed.
No, it's a few years ago, I believe. Now, this is with very, very spookily. I've got a funny feeling she died the same day as Paul Cannon.
Okay.
Now, that was in 2016, I think.
Yeah, I got it right here. January 28, 2016, she passed away. So
then it is. She and Paul passed away on the same day.
Wow, okay.
Pretty sure of that, which is crazy, really. But she really kind of disappeared into obscurity after she left Airplane. That was that.
And then the title, Surrealistic Pillow, that comes from Jerry Garcia. What's the story behind that? And what's the deal with Jerry being credited as, quote, musical and spiritual advisor?
Yeah, Jerry was that's a very sort of, it's a nicely oblique, hip way of calling somebody who happened to be there in the studio producing some of the songs and playing guitar on them, which is basically what Jerry was doing. He was a bit of a karmic hero around the Bay Area. By that time, Grateful Dead were, really, showing what they were made of. Yeah. Much as Airplane were, and they'd become quite close. They were sort of brothers in arms in many ways, the Dead and the Airplane. They hung out together and had gunfights together and all sorts of strange things like that. But Jerry, it's said that Jerry was supposed to be there to stop the RCA Victor producer Rick Jarrard turning the whole album into a pop fest, which is what RCA Victor, and Jarrard was RCA Victor's man, was what they wanted. RCA Victor knew that they had a potentially star band here, and they didn't want that spoiled. So that's what Rick Jarrard was there for. But then, as I said earlier, I think, according to Grace Slick, Jarrard was drunk for all the sessions. So Jerry may have produced a lot more than, we've come to imagine. But as far as I'm aware, he rearranged Somebody to Love from the Great Society's original, and he played on Coming Back to Me. I think he did the arrangement, played and arranged Today as well. So he had a lot to do with the how wonderful that album became.
And it was a quote, Surrealistic Pillow. Was that?
Yeah, he said.
I got it here. Yeah, here it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, I'll let you.
He was describing the music. He described it as being, it's as surrealistic as a pillow is soft.
Yeah, Jerry.
Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah, well, you've got to remember, this is the guy whose bass player once asked Dave Hassinger to reproduce the sound of thick air when he was making Anthem of the Sun, which is Grateful Dead's second album.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
It's his 1967. Hey, what can I say?
Yeah, you just know, because I'm such a huge Dead fan, that tone, that Jerry tone, and so when the track Today kicks in, he's playing that high lead, and
it twinkles, doesn't it? Right? It just twinkles. Beautiful.
It's him. It's got him all over it. But what other tracks is he on? You said there's an acoustic track he plays on too.
Well, he's certainly on Coming Back to Me, which Marty wrote while under the influence of. He was very stoned when he wrote it, and he literally took him half an hour to write it while he was high, and he wanted to get it recorded before his high wore off. So he ran back to the studio, and the only people in the studio when he got back there was, I think, either Hassinger or Jarrard was there. I think it's Hassinger. And Grace was there, I think, and Jerry. And they just put together this exquisite song, Coming Back to Me, which is 5 minutes of pure pop heaven.
Yeah,
gorgeous.
Absolutely.
You know, and it was it was as impromptu as that, you know. Lovely.
Jerry is also, I think, what is it, Plastic Fantastic Lover he might be on too.
He might be, yeah. I can't speak to that. I'm not sure, but he might well have been. I think he was on a lot, certainly a lot more than was hinted at by the sleeve credit anyway.
And what does he do with Somebody to Love? He rearranges that.
He does, yes. He basically, it speeds up from the Great Society's original. It's a hugely different arrangement. Yes, I just guess they wanted to distance it from the way it had Grace and her band at the time had treated it before. You know, they wanted a new treatment for it.
It was written by Darby Slick.
Yes.
Yeah, he's Grace's brother-in-law. So they wrote it together. Okay. Great Society. They wrote it while that band was going. So there's a JFK connection to this song too, right?
Well, yeah. I can't get that from the lyric. I have heard that Darby asserted several years later that he wrote Somebody to Love about JFK, but he was no more forthcoming than that. And it's difficult to discern why, in particular, Jack Kennedy should have been evoked in that manner. I don't know. I have no idea. That was what Darby said. Yeah. At the time, he just said that he was in a depressive fog on the come down from an acid trip, and the outcome is this rather acid, and it's a very acid love song. Actually, it's a very unconventional love song. It's certainly not. It's not Hearts and Flowers and Blue Jeans and Moonbeams, and certainly not something that Marty would have written at the time. Funnily enough, I've always thought the lyrics of Somebody to Love could well have been written by Grace herself because they're quite spiky in places.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. White Rabbit, another timeless classic recorded by Jefferson Airplane, another from the Great Society days. You write, quote, written in just a half an hour by Grace Slick after an acid trip accompanied by the Miles Davis, Gil Evans masterpiece Sketches of Spain on continuous loop. Can you talk about the lyrical influence and the musical influence on this song? A sign of what would be coming in the future in terms of Grace's music being Spanish in flavor.
Yes, and I don't know whether Grace had a specific affinity for Spanish music. Personally, there's not. She doesn't explicitly state as much in her autobiography or her biography, but there's no doubt that Spanish flavors come through in her music all the way through. You know, you can go up to much later solo albums like Dreams, for example, and there's plenty of Spanish flavorings there. So, you know, Spain was never that very far away from, you know, her mindset, really. That bolero thing that was going on there, which was, you know, one of those things that kind of summoned me in the first place, really. Lyrically, she was basically channeling fantasy writing of people like Lewis Carroll, specifically Lewis Carroll, really, Alice in Wonderland. And she later made the point, and it's a fair one if you think about it, that it was rather inconsistent of conservative parents to criticize their children's drug use if the kind of literature they were bringing their kids up on, the fantasy writing they were bringing their kids up on, was in itself arguably inspired by drugs. Because I suspect that Lewis Carroll I don't think he wrote Alice in Wonderland on tea and Weetabix.
What a bass line, too.
Yes. Yeah, beautiful. Beautiful.
Now, aside from the hit singles, what are some of your standout album tracks from Surrealistic Pillow? I hear some Simon and Garfunkel influences. I hear the Byrds in there.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It's all there. I mean, those kind of folk rock signifiers at the time, definitely.
Nice harmonies.
I mean, some of those harmonies. There's my favorite track, and it's actually one of if push came to shove, I'd have to say it's probably my favorite Airplane song, and that's DCBA 25,
that's titled after what, like a chord structure?
Yes, DCBA is the chord structure. The 25, it refers to, this is good old Paul Kantner, refers to LSD-25, 25 being, okay. I think that was the batch number of the original or something like that. Gotcha. Something like that. It was definitely, you know, acid. It's perfect. It's a perfect song. Beautiful, poetic lyrics, and the close harmony vocals are just astonishing because they're really subtle, they're really clever, just gorgeous.
Embryonic Journey is another one.
Embryonic Journey, yeah, it's a real masterclass. That was something that apparently Yorma was picking in the studio just idly. They were between takes of something else, and they were just all sort of hanging in the studio. So Yorma was picking away at this thing on his acoustic guitar, and I don't know if it was Hassinger or Jarrard. I think it was Jarrard said, "Hey, that's really good. We should include that." He said, "No, don't be silly. No, it's just nothing. It's just off the cuff." And no, they said the kind of producer insisted we've really got to get this on there, and there we are. And that's become one of his most celebrated pieces. I think he played it when the Airplane were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and it's kind of followed him ever since. And it's under 2 minutes. It's a masterclass of blues picking. Beautiful.
11 tracks. There isn't a clunker on that album.
No,
really.
I agree. The whole thing's fantastic.
Huge commercial success, goes all the way to number 3, platinum. It's since been ranked among the greatest albums of all time by many music publications, including Rolling Stone. They have it in their top. They ranked it 146 on their list of the 500 greatest albums of all time. Now, you write in the chapter on the band's next album, 1967's After Bathing at Baxter's, that's the name of the album, quote, "The success of Surrealistic Pillow, fanfare Jefferson Airplane's rise to superstar status. The band was awash in record company cash. Everyone buoyed by the knowledge that 2 huge era-defining hit singles meant they could do little wrong. Yet all of Airplane's subsequent music would be distanced by orders of magnitude, not only from the debut album, but from the sophomore on which the band's success was founded." So can you expand on that a little bit? Was it one of those impossible to follow situations that the band found themselves in?
In a sense, it was, but mainly because this is the point at which Airplane is starting to argue among themselves, which meant that the music was always the music was never going to be the same again. So you're right to suggest that Surrealistic Pillow was probably impossible to follow. The band were really beginning to fracture. The internal disagreements over the musical direction meant that whatever they subsequently produced was, rightly or wrongly, going to be a lot different to what had gone before. At least there's a plus to all this, because the squabbling at this stage he hasn't yet spoiling the creative output to the extent it later did. Then maybe there was a residue of hippie idealism kicking around, I don't know. Maybe they were all reasonably tolerant of each other still, to allow everybody to make his or her musical statements and readily contribute to them. But it's notable that Marty Balin has very little to do with After Bathing at Baxter's. I think he's only got one credit, and that's one credit. Is it just the one credit? And possibly that's just one song that he co-writes with Paul.
Yeah.
So he's becoming marginalised now.
Yeah, Young Girl Sunday Blues.
Yes.
With Cantner, he wrote that. Yeah.
Yes, so there's a very different band kind of incubating at this point. And After Bathing at Baxter's turns out to be a very different animal indeed. I think it's a great album, but it took me about 10 years to actually get to that recognition. I mentioned that, I got into the Airplane at 14 on the basis of the White Rabbit single. And I sourced the singles as, the local market, that I managed to get the Greasy Heart single, and somebody said, White Rabbit, da-da-da-da. So I'm sort of slowly starting a collection of Jefferson Airplane records, but no album yet. Now, I was doing a paper round, so I had money in my pocket, and I thought, I'm going to buy a Jefferson Airplane album. Which one am I going to buy? I passed over Surrealistic Pillow, which was probably the best, or certainly among the very best, basically because I didn't think much of the sleeve. I mean, it's a rather mundane sleeve, apart from the fact that Grace looks absolutely gorgeous on it. It's a very mediocre sleeve, considering the treasures that it contains. So the only other albums available at that time were import only Jefferson Airplane Takes Off, which was out of the question because it was import only and cost a lot of money. So after that, it's either After Bathing at Baxter's or Crown of Creation. Both got great sleeves, but I absolutely adored that crazy hybrid flying machine come flying house, the sort of crazy afternoons thing. I adored. So I thought, I'm going to get that on the sleeve. So, hey, guys and gals, marketing works.
I was going to say, that was the time. Album
record.
Covers, they made the difference.
Absolutely, yeah. Did. But I got it home, and I thought, this is strange stuff. it wasn't White Rabbit, and it wasn't Fantastic Lover. This was something else altogether. And it probably, if I'm honest, it probably took me about 10 years to really get into that record. It's a very cold, cerebral album. But there are treasures there, and they made themselves shown eventually.
And by the way, the album title translates to "After Tripping on Acid." How do you connect those two? I don't know, but I guess that's like
Airplane always did have a flair for the non sequitur.
The singles were "The Ballad of You and Me" and "Punil" and "Watch Her Ride." So yeah, didn't have that big hit single, and there was quite a bit of bad blood between the band's manager and Marty Balin.
Yeah.
Soon after, bad blood between Marty and the rest of the band, and you write about egos getting out of control. I mean, how quickly the decline happens, right?
Yeah.
You also write that despite Airplane being on top of the world was in bad shape. The San Francisco that nurtured that counterculture was now in decline, and the first wave of psychedelia was on borrowed time. Were you surprised that the band didn't implode and just come to an end at this point?
I don't think they'd have been allowed to, Eric, to be honest with you. They were making a lot of money. They were making a lot of money for a lot of other people, not only themselves. RCA Victor probably had them tied down to some sort of heavy contract. The whole recording process behind After Bathing at Baxter's was tabled as just being this kind of drug-soaked pajama party. They had the run of the studio. RCA Victor just gave them, that was it. They just plowed money into them and said, you can have what you want. Take all the time you want, just make us a record. And it got down to nitrous oxide tanks in the studio and Jorma Kaukonen riding his Harley Davidson around the middle of the studio and all this crazy, crazy stuff. All out of their skulls, all doing crazy things at the desk just because they could. And it's lucky in a way that it came, because it is a good album. As I say, tough to get into at first, but it is genuinely a good record. And it's the big surprise is perhaps that it was as good as it was, given the circumstances under which it was made, because you think with that amount of tinkering, there'd be just this sort of overproduced mess, and it wasn't. That was later. But
the fourth studio album, Crown of Creation, that's released in August of '68, and from reading the book, this is when Marty and the band are taking care of business, managerial changes, song publishing, a real estate purchase. Talk about where the band is at from that standpoint in the summer of '68.
Pretty rich and pretty keen to hang on to it all. By this time they're kind of they're admitting they're not really hippies. I mean, that was the fact of the matter. I mean, they like guns and machinery, which is Spencer Dryden actually said. We're not hippies. We're not like those guys down on the streets in the Haight. They live in a big house. They're making a lot of money. They have their sort of pretend gunfights with the Grateful Dead. The notion of the hippie ideal seems to be deserting them already. But they're still making some great music. Bill Thompson has now taken over from Bill Graham as full-time Airplane manager, and it's Thompson who's really quite canny, because he's the guy who facilitates the purchase of the mansion at 2400 Fulton, which became the band's HQ. And I think that's quite a landmark in San Francisco now. I think that's one of those sort of, you go on the rock and roll tour. I've never been to San Francisco, unfortunately. You understand that if you go on a rock and roll tour of San Francisco, that's on it's on the map. It's
still standing, still there.
Yeah. He also sets up Ice Bag Corporation for the in-house publishing. So he's kind of feathering their nest very nicely, and they're doing very nicely, thank you. But outside, the world outside those, mansion walls, it's going to hell in a handcart. Bobby Kennedy's assassinated in 1968. Martin Luther King, student riots in Europe. There are race riots across the US. The Vietnam War is going mad because there's been the Tet Offensive. So things are really not good.
They're more disciplined on Crown of Creation. This is their fourth studio album, I believe.
I think that maybe somebody might have had a word from RCA and said, come on, guys, that last one was a bit strange. Give us something we can sort of get hold of and we understand. And that may or may not have happened, I don't know. But certainly it's a very dark record. The thing about After Bathing at Baxter's was, though it is a cerebral record, there's still plenty of psychedelic sunshine there. You know, a lot of those songs are purely about acid tripping. That's not really happening on Crown of Creation because there's darker stuff going on now. In a sense, the sleeve picture of Crown of Creation kind of sums up the album because you've got the Hiroshima mushroom cloud, which is clearly on everybody's minds. You've got The House at Pooneil Corners, which is the final track. It's, in a sense, the kind of evil twin. If you take the original Pooneil from After Bailey and Baxter's, Pooneil, by the way, being Paul's own name for the folk singer Fred Neil, who was a big influence and a good friend. And I think it was Grace who coined the Pooneil thing. She called him Pooneil for some reason. So Pooneil sort of stuck. So we had the Ballad of You and Me and Pooneil, which is a very, very lysergic song, very psychedelic. House at Pooneil Corners is somewhere else again. It's basically nuclear apocalypse. Well, it's the generational collapse after, or the genetic collapse after nuclear holocaust, which is a pretty heavy subject. There's also the title track, Crown of Creation, which is based on John Wyndham's book, The Chrysalids, which is, again, it's a post-apocalyptic world involving telepaths and a very primitive theocracy as a society. It's doomy stuff. It really is.
Yeah, you say it's their darkest album of them all.
I think it is, yeah. And it's probably my favourite, but I think I put that in the book as my favourite. But then again, you know, Surrealistic Pillow, I hear that, I think, oh no. You know, I couldn't make up my mind really. But, you know, it's a stunning record. It really is. And it does have a new discipline about it. It's as if they're kind of paring back their instincts for excess, just being a little bit more disciplined in the way they approach the songwriting and the playing of those songs. And I think it's admirable in that respect.
And speaking of playing the songs, the reinterpretations of the band's previously issued songs on that live album, that comes next. Bless Its Pointed Little Head, that's released January of 1969. As a big fan of the King Kong films, I love the band's inclusion of a clip from the 1933 original. This opens the live album. And they used that to introduce their live shows. Can you talk about why they chose that clip and what they originally wanted to title it? But RCA said no to. Well,
the original, they wanted to call it King Kong, but Kong spelled C-O-N-G, as in Viet Cong, because this is the politicization of the radical left-wing politics that are coming out especially with Paul Cameron's writing. They're kind of it's almost like they're siding with the Vietnamese army, which a lot of people probably did at that time. You know, perhaps mistakenly, but we won't go into that. But put it this way, the band wanted King Kong. RCA said no way, you're not going to do it. So they decided, for no reason whatsoever, to call it Clergy. And literally, that's an example of an airplane non sequitur. It doesn't mean a thing, you know. Why? Okay, no reason. It's just called Clergy.
Clergy, yeah.
I imagine that they probably used that particular King Kong clip. I take it as being kind of an ironic idea from the film of Beauty killing the Beast, but not the airplane.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's just my spin on it.
I love it. That's so cool. The next studio album, the band's fifth, is 1969's Volunteers. I love this album. This is released in November of that year, after the band's appearance at Woodstock, just a month before their appearance at the disastrous Altamont concert. The title track released as a single. Now that was brought back to prominence in the 90s when it was used on the film Forrest Gump. And this is Airplane's last great album, according to you.
Yeah, I think so.
The lush acoustics throughout this album. I love the way it's produced. The songs are more polished and focused than on the previous records, in my opinion. Sadly, their last great album, as you're right, though, it coincides with the decline of counterculture and all that was good about the late 60s movement. What are your thoughts on the Volunteers and your personal highlights from that album?
Well, as you say, I agree. A lovely record, very slick and very polished, and a different animal than the Airplane had been, but none the worse for that. It does sound. I mean, Spencer Dryden once memorably described the band as 6 musicians in search of an arrangement, which is a really nice way of describing it, because there was this sense of, that, hey, what are we going to do? Just go on stage. What are we going to do now? I'll just play. Okay, well, all right, play something in C. Okay, on we go. And by the time Volunteers comes down, and again, we had Crown of Creation, which certainly evinced a more disciplined band. I think that the disciplines are coming more to the fore yet again in Volunteers, much more so. Everything's kind of less scattergun than, the classic Airplane. It's kind of machined and shiny, but not so much so that all the Jefferson Airplane personality is airbrushed out. There's some really mature songwriting, especially, I think, Grace's Eskimo Blue Day is spectacular. It's a really, really clever lyric. It's astounding stuff. And there's Wooden Ships, We Can Be Together, and the title track. They are great, great songs. But again, I think Airplane are reflecting the world outside. Maybe they're doing the job of a rock and roll band. Reflect the tenor of the times, and they did this admirably. Because if you think of Surrealistic Pillow as being 1967 kind of bottled, if you like, and Crown of Creation being 1968 encapsulated, it kind of works. By 1969, the hippies were becoming quite agit-proppy. They were, kind of clenched fists in the air and, up against the wall and all the rest of it. Suddenly there's a kind of muscularity in the air. And I think the Airplane capture that absolutely perfectly on that album.
In that period from 1970 to 1974, we do see the decline and the dissolution of Jefferson Airplane. We have two more studio albums. There's 1971's Bark and 1972's Long John Silver. Marty Balin was no longer in the band. He was really affected by the death of Janis Joplin.
Yeah.
And the use of drugs, no longer a conduit to creativity. It was taking lives. Without his vocals, and more importantly, songwriting contribution, things just weren't the same. You quote Paul Kantner, who later said, without Marty, there was no centrifugal force pulling the parts together. So those two albums, is there anything worthy of listening to? Or
there is. Bark has got its moments. There are a couple of really good tracks. Lawman is a great track. That's one of Grace Slick's best songs, and it's a brilliant arrangement. There's also Feel So Good, which is Yorma and Jack. Really, it's a sort of, in essence, it's kind of embryonic hot tuna. It's Yorma and Jack with, I think, Sammy Piazza on drums, possibly. And it was just, I think, there may have been, a couple of others in there somewhere. But it's a straight down the line blues, and it's brilliant, beautiful. Pretty As You Feel is quite a decent track written by Joey Covington, who at that point wasn't writing very many good songs, but that wasn't a bad one. Crazy Miranda's a good Grace Slick song as well, a very good observational song that kind of follows on from her observations about high fashion in Greasy Heart. Very, very good song. But then there are things like Funk and Never Argue with a German Unless You're Tired, or was it Never Tell a German You Tired? I can't remember the exact title of the song, but it was horrible. It really wasn't very good. There's a definite sense that the coherence is vanishing from the band. So they're still capable of some good music, but, I think Paul had it, he nailed that. He said there's no centrifugal force pulling the parts together. I think he's absolutely right. Once Marty was gone, and Marty was nothing, apart from being a very, very fine songwriter and one of the greatest rock singers of all, was a facilitator. He had he was a little human dynamo who just pulled people together. Once he was off the scene, yes, everything was allowed to spin out of orbit, really.
Yeah, and here comes Jefferson Starship in 1974. That's what they became, formed by Grace Slick and Paul Kantner, went through many lineup changes, but not without some commercial success. Before retiring the name in 1984, it was then shortened to Starship. In 1989, we did get the Jefferson Airplane reunion. A self-titled studio album was released. It didn't go so well, right? Reunion,
well,
disappointing. The critics.
It was regarded. The trouble is, by 1989, Airplane were about as unfashionable as it could get. And I don't think they could have done anything other than receive, opprobrium from the industry. You just knew that Rolling Stone were going to weigh into it, and other right, John Savage weighed into it, and everybody said it was a load of rubbish. I don't agree. I don't think it's a bad record. I just don't think it's a Jefferson Airplane record. In a sense, it's like a Toto album. Admit that I'm a very big fan of Toto. I think they're a really fine band. Very, very machine, very slick, no question of that. But, that's not always necessarily a bad thing. It's interesting that there's one of the songs on the the Airplane reunion album, is actually written by two members of Toto. So they've got session musicians there. They got back together, but they didn't invite Spencer along for the ride because there was still some issues over Bill Graham, residual stuff, and stuff going on that Paul basically didn't want Spencer on the train. So they brought in a session guy called Kenny Aronoff, who's a real heavy hitter, great drummer, session man.
Still is.
Well, yes, absolutely. Played for a long time with John Mellencamp. I mean, he's a terrific drummer. Good choice. So you've got a very slick album. It's a great 80s power pop album with 2 or 3 very good songs. A couple of dogs. It's all a bit it's very kind of 80s compressed percussion, that sort of feel, the gated feel and all the rest of it. But I think it gets a bad press. I really do.
It reminds me of the CSNY album that came out maybe that same year.
Yes. Yeah, I guess so. I mean, in a sense, yeah, you could argue it's
sound.
Yeah. I mean, everybody was kind of going that way just because of the 80s. I mean, there weren't very many. I mean, we last time we spoke, Eric, we talked about Pink Floyd and what they did with Momentary Lapse of Reason, which is a very 80s feel to it. Again, the gated reverb and all the rest of it. I think it was difficult for bands and artists not to fall into that trap. Some would make it work. I think Floyd did, generally speaking. And Airplane, strangely enough, made it work. Just as long as you don't call it a Jefferson Airplane album.
What do you think Jefferson Airplane should be remembered most for? I mean,
just astoundingly influential, which is a bit of a catch-all bland thing to say, really, maybe. But, I mean, as I think I mentioned earlier, they were very, very big on the UK underground scene. And a lot of bands here adopted that same kind of profile. 4 or 5 male instrumentalists plus charismatic female lead singer. Early Fairport Convention, who absolutely, they idolised Airplane and modelled themselves on Airplane. And actually, they're personal subjective view, but they never bettered what they did when they were trying to be an English Jefferson Airplane. I don't know, the breadth of musical vision, perhaps, again, getting back to that notion that there were so many strange, disparate ingredients being thrown into this big melting pot. They're a band that they've kind of got Leadbelly, they got Otis Redding, the Byrds, Dylan, the Beatles, Fred Neil, the Weavers, Miles Davis, Lewis Carroll, B.B. King, Isaac Asimov. I mean, for all that lot, literary and musical heroes thrown into a big pot. Now, on the other side comes something completely new, and which work absolutely beautifully for a short time. So, like a morning glory, if you like. Maybe it wasn't ever meant to last. Maybe the Airplane weren't built to last. Maybe that they had to have that small trajectory, mirroring the trajectory of the era. Yeah. They were of the time, and the time was of them.
Yeah, right place, right time, but not for a long time.
Yeah, and that's good in a sense. Even though they fizzled out, rather than, too glib and easy for me in my armchair just to say, well, they should have just knocked on the head off the Volunteers. That's the way it didn't work that way. But I kind of in my own head, I think of Volunteers as being their final last great shout. And after that, it was just sort of okay stuff here and there.
Jefferson Airplane, every album, every song. It is out now through Sonicbond, available through Burning Shed in the UK, Amazon here in the US. Richard, thanks so much.
Thank you, Eric. It's been a privilege.
That's it. It's in the books.